All right, let's talk about some different parts of the brain and the different functions of the brain and where they are localized in the brain. Arousal versus sleep. So arousal is another way of saying awake. And sleep is a very important and active state for the brain. It used to be thought that sleep was the brain resting. And now we know that's not true at all, that in fact the brain is very active during sleep. Sleep is essential for survival. It's essential for life. If you deprive someone completely of sleep, they'll die in 2 to 3 weeks. So that's how important sleep is for the brain. People who short sleep over long periods of time, like people who say they only need 5 or 6 hours of sleep a night and do that year after year after year, are at much higher risk of all kinds of brain diseases, including Alzheimer's. They're at higher risk of heart disease and cancer. So sleep is really important. It's not just rest. Sleep, we now know that during sleep, the glial cells become very active and flush out waste material from the brain. And sleep is a very sudden onset state. We often think of and we feel like we slowly fall asleep, but when we put people in the sleep lab and put electrodes on their head, we can see that awake and asleep is the flip of a switch. It happens very suddenly, which is why people fall asleep while they're driving. They don't think they're going to fall asleep, but it happens suddenly, and they don't have control over that if they're very overtired. Sleep is triggered by a structure in the brainstem called the reticular formation, and part of the reason that we know that is because people who have damage to the reticular formation, one of the consequences can sometimes be the total lack of any ability to fall asleep. If you deprive people of sleep for only 24 hours, the function of their brain is measurably worse. So there's been a big movement in this country to stop the practice of forcing doctors to stay up for 24, 36, 48 hours at a stretch and do surgeries on people and treat people in the emergency room, because we can show measurably that staying up all night, your motor functions are about the same as somebody who's at the legal limit for alcohol. So you're behaving and your motor skills are about the same as somebody who's got 0.08% alcohol in their blood, right at the legal limit for being drunk driving. So, and several days without sleep, you will start to have hallucinations. You will start to lose your ability to perform normal motor skills and become very uncoordinated. So clearly things that are happening during sleep are very important. It's not just rest. So the reticular formation is in the brainstem, and that's what flips the switch. And there are various things that happen during sleep. One of the things that happens is when you're awake, all of your neurons are firing, doing their thing. While you're asleep, the neurons fire in synchronous waves. So it's sort of like when you put electrodes on somebody's head, it's like you're listening to a crowd in a stadium. If you had a few microphones around the stadium and you're just listening to all the constant noise of all these people talking. But if people do a coordinated cheer or the wave, that goes around the stadium, now that's more representative of what your neurons are doing while you're asleep. And that's the difference. That's why we see electrical activity convert to these waves when people go to sleep, is because neurons are all firing together at the same time. There's also dream sleep and non-dream sleep. And we know that as the night goes on, the amount of REM sleep or dream sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, increases. And we know that of the different stages of sleep, REM sleep is the most important. If you deprive people of REM sleep by waking them up every time they have a dream, you will see deficits in their motor performance, their cognitive function, much more rapidly than if you deprive them of the deeper stages of sleep, or the non-dream sleep. So exactly why that is, we're not sure. And during REM sleep or dream sleep, that's when you are paralyzed as well. One of the things that happens during dream sleep is that all of the muscles of your body are paralyzed, and in fact, you become really relaxed. And that's often when people fall out of a chair and lecture, they fall asleep, is when they enter the dream state. They lose all their muscle tone and become very relaxed and can start to fall out of the chair. And that's so that you don't act out your dreams. That's a significant and dangerous dysfunction. People who dream without having that paralysis and not just sleepwalk, but get up and act out their dreams. They often have to sleep alone in a locked room so that they don't injure other people or themselves. Animals have all kinds of adaptations for sleep because, of course, when you're asleep, you're vulnerable. And one of the human adaptations for sleep, or what is hypothesized to be an adaptation, because humans don't normally sleep alone, especially if you look at hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers usually sleep, a whole family sleeps in one room, essentially. And everybody's at a different stage in the sleep cycle. Children sleep very soundly compared to adults. Adults generally have very light stages of sleep when they're easily aroused by noises. And if you have a family group sleeping together, the chances that if there's some threatening noise, that someone is going to be in a light stage of sleep during that is actually pretty good. And that's considered to be possibly a human sleep adaptation. Some animals really do need very little sleep, like whales and dolphins, because really that's considered to be one of their adaptations to a marine environment where they have to air breathe, and they can't lay on the bottom of the ocean and sleep for 8 hours. Some animals have adaptations to only sleep half of their brain at a time. And there was a really interesting accidental experiment with ducks. A scientist was doing brain studies with ducks and birds and reptiles. And just by chance, one day he got a boa constrictor, which is what this picture is of here, and he had it in a clear glass tank, and he put it in the same room where his ducks were. And he noticed that all the ducks started sleeping with one eye open, and their open eye was looking at the snake cage. Of course, boas are predators of birds. That's their favorite food. Boa constrictors is birds. They're tree snakes. Not that the ducks knew that specifically. And then he thought this was very interesting. And then he noticed that the ducks would face one direction for a few hours with one eye open. And then they would get up, turn around 180 degrees, and then they would close the other eye. And when he put electrodes on them, they were only sleeping one side of their brain at a time. But they didn't do that when the snake wasn't in the room. They only started sleeping one half of their brain at a time when the snake was in the room. So very interesting accidental experiment. So something that they don't prefer to do, but they could do if they feel like they're in danger or they're in a dangerous environment. So this is interesting EEG readouts comparing sleep and wakefulness for these animals that sleep one side of their brain. So when you're awake, the EEG shows this kind of chaotic pattern of firing, because again, it's like having microphones at a football stadium that's full of people and they're all just making random noise. But during sleep, the neurons are firing synchronously, so you get these big swings up and down in activity as waves of neurons firing goes across the cortex of the brain. And interestingly, the same thing happens, even though there's a long period of time separating bird evolution from mammal evolution, you get similar effects during sleep. So Part of this, we already talked a little bit about biological clock regulation and the pineal gland and the production of melatonin in response to the lack of blue light is what triggers the production of melatonin. We also have an internal, in our brain, a clock that even in the total absence of external cues is going to try to continue to determine day and night. And there's been some very interesting experiments done with people who agreed to be put into these rooms that were lit 24 hours a day with dim light and no external cues at all about whether it's day or night, no windows, no live television, no way to figure out what time of day it actually is, just to see what happens to their biological clocks. And that people, surprisingly, agreed to live in these sleep chambers for weeks. And it turns out our natural biological clock is a little bit longer than a 24-hour clock. So if you just let it run with no external cues, it would tend to go forward a little bit every single day. So that tells us that normally our biological clock is being retuned every day by exposure to light and external cues. So that's why it's important to get outside during the day and get some sunlight on your eyeballs every day to reset that biological clock, and that will help you sleep better at night. If your brain knows when it's day and knows when it's night, you'll sleep better. If you have a blue phone shining in your eyes during the middle of the night, telling your brain that it's daytime, and during the day you're not going outside and you're sitting in a dark room working on a computer, your brain is not going to create the optimal biological rhythm for you, or circadian rhythm. You will not have optimal melatonin production at night when you should, and you won't get as good, deep, restful sleep as you should. So we need to be aware of that, since we are essentially biological hunter-gatherers that are just suddenly, in the last 100 years or so, living in a world where we don't have to ever go outside in the sun, and we have artificial light inside 24 hours a day if we want it. That's not what the environment that our brains evolved in. So the part of our brain that is keeping track of that clock, the one that's constantly being reset, we know where that resides, again, because of people who've had injury to that area and they lose this ability. And it's a place in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And it's sort of like a pacemaker. This is where the signals are originating from, even if you totally remove all external cues about whether it's day or night. We also have regions of the brain that are more responsible for emotional reactions to things and emotional memories. Probably you have heard that if you have a strong emotional reaction to an event, you're more likely to remember it. And that's probably because the area that is responsible for emotion and the area that's responsible for short-term memory being converted into long-term memory are actually right next to each other in the brain, the amygdala and the hippocampus, and also parts of the thalamus. And we call these the limbic system. Now, this is the unconscious part of the brain. This is not where you're having thoughts. Signals from these parts of the brain are bubbling up into the cortex and influencing our thoughts. That's why it sometimes feels like emotions are coming out of nowhere or coming externally, because they're coming from these unconscious parts of our brain where we don't have conscious sensation or thoughts, but it's still part of our brain. So, and remember, this is still part of the forebrain, that embryonic forebrain. So thalamus, hypothalamus, which we're very familiar with now, pituitary, olfactory bulbs, which connect. And you can see why so often smells are trigger memories because of all the senses, olfaction is very closely connected with the hippocampus and the amygdala. So the amygdala is the emotional center of the brain. People who have damage to the amygdala uh, don't feel emotions like other people do. And it often seems to not interfere with their function in life very much. But they just don't feel emotions. And interestingly, they often have extreme difficulty making decisions. And the hippocampus is associated with short-term memory and converting those short-term memories to long-term memories. So people with damage to the hippocampus, these are the people who get stuck in a loop and they can't no short-term memories can go to long-term memories. So they wake up every day forgetting what happened the day before. And it's sad, but that's how we know how every part of the brain functions, is because somebody had damage to that part of their brain and it got documented by some doctor or researcher and published in some scientific paper about this case study of this person who got shot in the head, had a stroke, something, industrial accident, and got a very specific injury, tumor, and had a very specific injury to one part of their brain. And what was the consequence of that? And those kind of studies still go on all the time. Case studies get published of a person who had a specific lesion in their brain and what was the consequence of that lesion in their behavior, in their personality, in their cognitive ability. So the most important area for emotional learning and emotional memory is the amygdala. It's near the base of the cerebrum. And it sends signals to many other parts of the brain. And an interesting side effect of that is we often think that making decisions is some kind of a logical process. Well, damaging the amygdala usually completely removes a person's ability to make decisions. They get stuck in trying to figure out what all the choices are, and they just can't make a decision. They just can't decide. And so that tells us that even though we think we're making logical decisions, the emotional part of our brain is actually participating in that, even though we don't realize it or don't want to think that it is, but it is. We have a couple of interesting ways we can analyze people's brains in healthy, normal people without damaging their brain in any way. The slightly more invasive one that's getting used less and less is PET scan. They often use PET scans for people who have cancer to look for metastases. So what they do with the PET scan is they give you a little bit of radioactive glucose, and then they look at your brain a half an hour later, or the rest of your body if they're looking for metastasized cancer, because of course cancer cells suck up glucose faster than any other cells in the body. So any tiny little cancerous tumors anywhere in your body will light up like Christmas lights. But they can also use it to look at your brain, and they can give you tasks to do. They can give people a little screen to look at, and they can ask them questions or show them images, and then they can see what parts of their brain are using glucose. A slightly safer method is functional magnetic resonance imaging, or functional MRI. And this is just looking at, would you stop ringing that bell? Stop that. You're not going out right now. Functional MRI that's looking at oxygen consumption in the brain. So we don't have to use anything radioactive for this. They can just set the MRI to specifically look at oxygen usage in a particular area of the brain. And that can be really useful. So that's what this image here is. This image is looking at oxygen usage. So what they did was play, in this particular experiment, play different kind of music for people, and then look at what parts of the brain lit up. And they've done really interesting experiments like this for people who are musicians, as well as people who are not trained in music at all, but who just enjoy listening to music, and seeing the difference different parts of the brain light up in musicians when they listen to music than ordinary people. Because, of course, musicians, the motor areas of their brain are also lighting up when they listen to music because they're imagining playing the music as well. So lots of really cool experiments and studies have been done with this. One of my favorite ones that has come out of these brain imaging experiments is to look at dogs' emotional reactions, because of course dogs have all the same parts of their brain as we do. All mammals do. All mammals have all the parts of the brain. We just have a larger frontal cortex than other animals, but we have all the same parts. And as one of the things that Darwin argued 150 years ago was that obviously if dogs have the same brain parts and your dog seems happy to see you and your dog acts like they love you, that they are obviously experiencing the same emotions that humans are. And you might think, well, duh. But actually, this was not a popular idea in science back then. Not until the 1960s, most scientists argued that the human emotional experience was completely unique and a result of our conscious mind, and that other animals just seemed to be looking like they were experiencing pain or grief or happiness, and that we shouldn't think that they're actually experiencing emotions, which now, given what we know now, just seems ridiculous. But I give Darwin credit for that too, is that he was a dog lover. He had 10 dogs at one point in his life, and he actually talked about that in one of his books, about how it just seemed ridiculous to say that another animal that has all the exact same parts of their brain that we do wouldn't experience emotions the same way that we do. But these kind of scans have shown that, in fact, when their owners talk to them, dogs' brains light up differently than when a stranger says the same exact thing to them. So very interesting results from these kind of brain scans that are totally non-invasive and completely safe, although they're expensive to do. These machines aren't widely available, so you have to have some research funding to do experiments like this. So let's talk about the four big parts of the brain. Frontal, temporal, occipital, and parietal are major structures in the brain that have boundaries. I mean, these were named by anatomists who were just looking at the physical structure of the brain and seeing that there were these distinct regions that seemed to have boundaries. So they're not just named randomly over the surface of a uniform brain. They do have distinct boundaries. And we now know, again, because of all of these deficit of function studies that have taken place over the last 200 years, we know what each part of the brain does. So the frontal lobe, which is the blue here, this is where the motor cortex is, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. This is where the decision-making part of the brain is, and this is also where speech is. Broca's area here, if you have a stroke that affects Broca's area on the left side of your brain, if you're a right-handed person, you lose the ability to speak. Now, for the speech areas, there's a difference between the right and the left. Generally, for most right-handed people, so a little over 90% of the population is right-handed. So if you're right-handed, chances are that all of your speech resides in the left side of your brain. Normally, the right side of the brain can't speak at all and has no language in a right-handed person. There are people who have a little bit in both sides of their brain, though, even right-handed people. But left-handed people even more, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so Broca's area on the left side for right-handed people is for speaking. So if you lose Broca's area, you cannot control your mouth and your tongue anymore to form the words. You can't do it. You might know what you want to say. You still have language in your brain, but you can't make the words. You can't get them out. The parietal lobe is the sensory part of the brain. So the somatosensory cortex, where all of the sensory input from different parts of the body come in, and then the association cortex, associating all of that information and making sense out of it, also pain reception. Visual cortex, that's kind of obvious what that is, and the temporal lobe on the side is the hearing cortex. And also Wernicke's area, this is for language comprehension, so not hearing, but understanding the words that are heard. So individuals who have a stroke in Wernicke's area can't understand language anymore, but they can still speak, and they do, and they speak nonsense. Which is very interesting that they still can speak. They just have no idea what they're saying, and they can't. They lose their ability to comprehend spoken language, even their own. But they still talk, and some of them talk a lot, even though they have lost their comprehension of language, which could be which is fascinating. So information processing, we already talked about the midbrain being kind of a place where all of the neurons pass through sensory information to get to the rest of the brain, to go to the somatosensory cortex. And we're going to talk in the next chapter about all of this sensory information, hearing and vision and pain sensing, pressure, temperature, positional sensing. We're going to talk about all of that in the next chapter. So information that's going here, it is going to be integrated in the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is often called the area for planning and higher executive functions, it's often called. This is the area that is the target of ADHD drugs. So one of the things that was figured out in like the 1980s was that individuals who have problems with attention, ADHD individuals, the prefrontal cortex was less active than it was in other individuals who didn't have that same issue. And that's what those drugs do. They like Adderall and Ritalin. What they do is they're stimulants, but they preferentially stimulate the prefrontal cortex. And that's why they work for individuals who have attention deficit. So if we look here at the motor cortex, which is in the frontal lobe, and the somatosensory cortex, which is in the parietal lobe, they're actually right next to each other, which is really interesting. So the motor cortex is signals going out. So this is messages going out to the motor neurons to move different muscles in the body, the voluntary muscles. And you'll notice there's a large area of the brain devoted to the hand and the fingers, which makes sense. You know, we have a very great finger dexterity compared to even to other primates. A lot of motor cortex devoted to speech areas, so lips, tongue, jaws, very important for producing speech. And then the somatosensory cortex, which is right next door, this is getting information, and you'll notice that the areas that control each area are kind of close to each other in the brain. We have the head here, jaw, throat, next to the motor cortex that controls those same areas. And this creates an interesting effect. And that is when people have muscle or nerve damage, rather, or they have an amputation, and they're no longer, that part of their brain is no longer receiving information from that limb because it's missing, or from that particular area because a nerve has been cut. Now suddenly one part of the brain is very quiet and there isn't any signals coming in. Well, what happens is active areas nearby, some of that electrical activity leaks over into the quiet area because it's too quiet. There's no input at all coming into that area, and that's when you get phantom limb pain. It's because signals are coming in and leaking in from the noisy neighboring areas into this very quiet area that's no longer receiving any input at all from a limb that's been removed. And this usually gets better over a period of years. Some people have it much worse than others with the phantom limb phenomena, phantom pain. Some people even have, well, phantom limb pain is the worst because there's really not much that you can do for that. But some people have other weird sensations, like their limb that's not there is moving and doing things, which would be very unpleasant, I can imagine. And for the right and the left half, so your left hand is controlled by the right half of your brain, and vice versa. Your right hand is controlled by the left half of your brain. So if you're right-handed, the left side of your brain, that's where your speech center is, which kind of makes sense. We're going to write with our right hand, and that's controlled by the side of our brain where speech is. And for left-handed people, it's a little bit different. There are some right-handed people that have some speech in both sides of their brain, and they don't have the extreme lateralization that most people have. And for left-handed people, there's even a bigger variety of possibilities. So for the language and speech area, so Broca's area, individuals who have a stroke or something in Broca's area, they can understand perfect language perfectly well, but they can't speak. Sometimes they're very limited in their speech. Maybe they can still say a couple of words. Sometimes the only words they can still say are curse words. Or maybe one curse word, and that's the only word they can still say. Damage to Wernicke's area is the opposite. They can speak, but they speak nonsense, and they can't understand language anymore at all. Which is, it's fascinating that those two areas are completely different. So here we can see Broca's area lit up here when speaking. Wernicke's area lit up here for hearing words. For reading, we have the visual cortex is involved. And for thinking of what words to say, now we're in the prefrontal cortex, planning what words to say. So different parts of the brain get used depending on what exactly you're doing with language. So lateralization. So this is something that's become really popular in culture in the last 20 years, like, are you left-brained or right-brained? Because it was discovered that and this is mostly for right-handed people, that the left hemisphere is not only has all of your language, but also has math, logic, processing of any kind of logical math-like information. And the right hemisphere is better at pattern recognition, facial recognition. We have a very small part of our brain that's extremely adept at facial recognition. That's in the other side of the brain, for most people, in the right side of the brain. Spatial relationships, if you're estimating sizes of things, like probably all of us do this all the time, you're trying to estimate, how many ounces of meat is that? Oh, that looks like that's about a cup. That looks like that's about 4 ounces. All that kind of spatial stuff, that's in the right side of the brain. And will something fit into something else? Have you ever tried to, you have leftovers and you're trying to pull out the right size container, and you say, oh, I'm looking at this and I think it's going to fit all in this container. And somebody else says, no, that container's not big enough. You need something bigger. That's not going to fit in there. That's the right side of your brain. Now, people who are left-handed, Some left-handed people are an exact mirror image of what your typical right-handed person is. And so all of their language is in the right side of their brain, their math ability, and the left side of their brain is the creative, spatial side of the brain. But many left-handed people are a mixture. They have language on both sides of their brain, they have math ability on both sides of their brain, and both sides of their brain kind of do everything. And yeah, they seem to be perfectly functional. So one question has been, why are most people right-handed? And why isn't everybody right-handed? Being left-handed is not rare. So possibly, and it's genetic, possibly the genes involved, there is some advantage there. There are things that correlate with left-handedness, like just generally people who are left-handed on average have higher math ability than people who are right-handed. People who are left-handed are also more likely to be stutterers. We've had quite a few left-handed presidents as well. So even though it's quite rare, we have had several. Look it up. Look up left-handed famous people. You'll be surprised at what a small percentage of the population they are, but they are overrepresented among scientists and mathematicians and actors. So it's an interesting that they have this lack of lateralization, which we think is so adaptive and important generally. And I'm right-handed, and I have no reason to think that my brain is as lateralized as everything else. Although I've never been tested, I think it would be fun to be tested and see, because I have a lot of left-handed people in my family, including my dad is left-handed. So it would be interesting to see what the importance of that is, and to know, everybody would like to know what their own brain is doing. Unfortunately, that's not available unless you're part of some kind of a research study. So this idea that in every person is more right-brained or more left-brained, there's no basis for that. They haven't found people who don't use one side of their brain or the other. That everybody's using both sides of their brain. Just because when you do a math problem, your left brain lights up, and if you're looking at Picasso paintings, your right brain lights up. Nobody is using one side of their brain more than the other. Or that is just, somebody took that from the scientific information about the right and left brain lateralization, and it's not based on science. So if you're a very creative person, that's not because you only are using your right brain and you're not using your left brain. So again, the frontal lobe, that's where our planning, decision making, our executive functions are. The most famous case for determining that was this guy named Phineas Gage, who I think it was the late 1800s, had a famous accident at work. He was laying railroad ties, and they were using explosives, and he was tamping down the explosives, and it blew up prematurely, and this metal rod went through his head, and amazingly, he didn't die. In fact, I don't think he ever lost consciousness, but it changed his entire personality. He went from being a crew foreman who was very well respected, was married, was a nice guy, very well liked, to being a guy who he eventually lost his job. He became very impulsive. He started cursing all the time. He was mean to people. His wife finally left him because she couldn't stand it anymore. But the documentation of how his whole personality changed based on damage to the prefrontal cortex was probably the first time that scientists started to focus really on what exactly is each part of the brain doing. And it became a really famous case study. And there's lots and lots of little mini documentaries on YouTube. Phineas Gage. Phineas starts with a PH. Phineas Gage, Gage. And you can find tons of information on him. There's probably hour-long documentaries on him and what happened to him. A very interesting case study, and there are many case studies like that we have learned about how the brain works. So we have always thought of, among vertebrates, that primates had the most advanced cognition. If you look at the neocortex of primates, especially humans, it's very convoluted for lots of surface area, and it was thought that that was a signal that an organism would be very intelligent, as if they had a large neocortex with a very convoluted, wrinkly looking surface. But in fact, that's not the case in birds. Birds have really smooth brain. They have a large brain with lots of neurons. In fact, some birds, like parrots and crows and ravens, have about the same number of neurons in their brains as some primates. And it's not a surprise because they're very intelligent. But their brains are smooth. They don't have a convoluted surface. So how do they pack all those neurons in there? Well, it turns out that instead of having them kind of uniformly spread out in this gray matter, like mammals do, instead they have clusters of tightly packed neurons that are clustered together into nuclei, and the organization of their brain is actually completely different. Their cerebrum has very different organization, and where each, the visual cortex and motor cortex and everything is very different than in mammals, which it's not a surprise since they evolved very separately. Our last common ancestor with birds would have been before the dinosaurs, so about 300 million years ago. So that's a long time in evolutionary terms. But scientists are finally coming around to studying bird intelligence as an interesting thing in its own right, and not just as a subset of or a contrast to mammal brains. So here's a bird brain with a very smooth cerebrum. The pallium is one part of their brain. That's where all these nuclei of all of these neurons are concentrated. But they have a very different organization, and where different sensory input is processed is very different from a mammal brain. But some things are the same. They still have a thalamus. That's where all the sensory information goes through. And the midbrain, they still have a cerebellum. That is where all the learned motor activity is. But, the evolution of the cerebrum has taken a different path in birds. But yet they are very intelligent. The only other tool makers besides humans and chimpanzees and dolphins and elephants are a few species of parrots and one species of crow. So they are certainly intelligent, even though their brain is very differently organized. Well, at least the cerebrum is differently organized, I should say that. The midbrain and the hindbrain are very similar to mammals because, of course, they share a reptilian ancestor with us. It was a long time ago. Neuronal plasticity refers to the ability of the nervous system to be modified, and it's generally thought that as one ages through childhood, that neuronal plasticity declines. If a child has a brain injury, they often have a very different result in terms of repair and adaptation of the brain compared to an adult who has a very similar kind of an injury. And that's because you lose plasticity as you get older. And some conditions are thought to be the result of possibly this shaping of the neurons. It doesn't go as it should. And of course, this is only a hypothesis. We really don't know what causes autism or anything on the spectrum. But one of the things that has been noticed about individuals with autism is that their neurons have more connections than average, which could be one of the reasons for extreme environmental sensitivities like light sensitivity, noise sensitivity, is because they're, the pruning of the neurons that normally happens doesn't happen, or doesn't happen as much. But of course, we have no idea at this point what causes autism. Of course, it's not vaccines. Everybody has heard the term now, short-term memory loss. It has become kind of a joke almost to say someone has short-term memory loss. So we have a memory that a short-term memory that lasts minutes to hours, depending on what it is. And if we don't process that memory and send it to our long-term memory in the cortex, it's lost. And it's probably a good thing, because we lose lots of things. I mean, imagine if you remembered every meal you ate for your entire life. It's probably good that a lot of that mundane, everyday things we don't remember. Now, there are people who remember that kind of stuff, who can literally remember every day of their life, what the weather was like, what they did, what they ate, but it doesn't seem to be an advantage to them. In fact, it seems to be this excessive memory that they have seems to be a burden to them. But then there's the opposite of people who can't process any memories into long-term memory, and that's happens more and more during aging. It happens during processes like in dementia, but it also can happen because of an injury to the hippocampus due to a tumor, a stroke, even a car accident. Can damage the hippocampus, and then people can remember things for different lengths of time. Like some people have short-term memories that will last for minutes or hours or a day, and then they never get turned into long-term memories. And many of these people have been the subject of extensive study trying to figure out what exactly has happened to them. And sometimes it gets better. Sometimes people are in a car accident, they totally lose their ability to form long-term memories, and then that ability slowly comes back over weeks or months. Memory, sleep is really important for memory as well. That's one of the times that we consolidate memory. Also very important for muscle memory. Well, I'm calling it muscle memory, but I really mean the cerebellum. It's been shown that when people learn a motor skill, like playing a musical instrument, driving, something like that, you sleep on it, you're better than you were the day before when you stopped practicing. So there is something to that. Oh, and test performance. It's been shown that if people study and then get more than 6 hours of sleep, they do better remembering the material for the exam than people who stay up all night studying and get very little sleep. So if you want to do well on an exam, get at least 6 hours of sleep a night. It's better to sleep than to keep studying and not sleep. You'll remember everything you did study better if you get sleep, and even better, get 8 hours of sleep before you're going to take an exam. So there are all kinds of nervous system disorders, some of which the causes and treatments are very well understood, and some we just pretty much throw drugs at them and see what works. Some of these we know there's a genetic component, but we don't have any idea what the genes are that are involved. We just know that something runs in families. You can look at twin studies and see, if identical twins are more likely to have it, both have it, than fraternal twins. That tells us that there's a genetic component, but it doesn't tell us at all what genes are involved or what possible environmental variables there might be. Schizophrenia is extremely serious. It affects a little less than 1% of the world's population. It usually manifests itself in young adulthood, so between 19 and 25 is the most common ages to be first diagnosed with schizophrenia. People with schizophrenia have trouble with what is real and what is not real. They have delusions. They think that people are following them. They think the government's putting microchips in their brain. They think that they're getting personal messages through their television. Those are all examples of delusion. Sometimes they hear voices. That's really common as a hallucination. It's less common to see things, hallucinations, but hearing voices is really common in schizophrenia. And there's other symptoms too. Schizophrenics are very often smokers because weirdly nicotine seems to have a beneficial effect for schizophrenics. So, and I don't think if somebody has schizophrenia, you should try to get them to stop smoking because it's been shown that it actually helps them. And really, we don't really know exactly what causes it, why certain drugs seem to work. Pretty much the treatments for schizophrenia have been developed by trial and error. Doctors have been throwing different psychiatric drugs at schizophrenia for 50 years and just figuring out, okay, this one sometimes works, and then if that one doesn't work, try this one, and that one sometimes works, and if that doesn't work, then try this one. Really, it's kind of a mystery, and it might be like many other illnesses, that it might be a cluster of illnesses that are all slightly different, and maybe in the future we'll have a better way to diagnose people and know what drug might actually work for them. There are really effective drugs for schizophrenia, but they have to be tried and see what works for an individual patient. But often what happens is people will start taking the drug, they start to feel better, they don't like the side effects, they stop taking the drug, they start to have problems again, hallucinations, delusions. Eventually then they get on drugs again, and it just turns into this roller coaster. So they really need help. People with schizophrenia need family members or other people who can help make sure they're taking their medicine and that they're doing okay, because it can be extremely debilitating. So what this graph is showing us is how, if you have a blood relative who has schizophrenia, how it increases an individual's chance of also being diagnosed with schizophrenia. So this shows us that there is a genetic component. So if you're just a random member of the population and you don't have any blood relatives with schizophrenia, your chances of being diagnosed with schizophrenia are about 1%. That's about the occurrence in the general population. And then the chances increase with the genetic relationship. So if you have an aunt or an uncle or a niece or nephew, grandchild, half-sibling, those are all people that you share about 25% of your DNA with. Chances increase. A first-degree relative, that would be full siblings, parents, children. So if you have a parent who has schizophrenia, your chances of eventually being diagnosed with schizophrenia are about 7 times average, about 7%. If you have a fraternal twin, so remember, fraternal twins aren't any more alike genetically than any other siblings. They're just going to have a more similar environment because they're the same age, they're born at the same time, same uterine environment. That drastically increases the chance that if one fraternal twin is diagnosed, the other one will be diagnosed, and now we're up to about 17%. So, but even with identical twins, if someone has an identical twin who's schizophrenic, their chances of also being diagnosed are a little less than 50%, even though they have 100% identical DNA. So what that tells us is that there's a very strong genetic component here, but it's only 50% of what's causing it. So an identical twin has less than a 50% chance that they'll also be diagnosed. So there's a very strong environmental factor at play as well. We just have no idea what that environmental factor might be. But this is one of the ways, by looking and comparing, identical twins versus fraternal twins. That's normally the comparison that we most want to do. That tells us that there's a strong genetic component here. And that's a genetic risk factor, not predetermined. So if somebody has a sibling or a twin that has a schizophrenia, that doesn't mean you're going to have it, but you have a greatly elevated risk. Depression is another one that the causes are not known, but we have some really good drugs now for depression and also for bipolar disorder, which is characterized by an alternation between being depressed and being manic, and there's different grades of bipolar disorder as well. And drugs that treat these have improved dramatically. And again, they've mostly been identified by trial and error and finding out what works. And it turns out that drugs that affect serotonin in the brain seem to have a big effect. So drugs that increase the amount of serotonin in the brain seem to be beneficial for both of these disorders. But again, it's kind of trial and error. And even the best drugs don't work for everybody. There's been some really cool experiments recently with ketamine, showing that it has an amazingly beneficial effect for people who are severely depressed, who don't respond to other kinds of treatments. In fact, there's a hospital in Chicago that has a big ketamine treatment center. I can't remember if it's Rush Hospital. One of them has a ketamine treatment center for people who are depressed, who either can't take the other kind of drugs or they don't work for them. So that's another recent one. So depression, even though we don't know what causes it, or bipolar disorder, the drugs are much more effective for this, but they still don't work for everybody. So the brain has a reward system that involves dopamine, and this is something that has evolved over millions of years to get us to do things that are beneficial for our survival, like eat food that's nutrient dense and stay away from predators, and stay with your social group. But we now have things in our environment that overstimulate the reward system and become addictive. Things like cocaine, amphetamines, heroin, alcohol, and tobacco, nicotine, which is extremely addictive. And we now know a bit about how these work. They work by actually causing the brain's reward circuitry to down-regulate the number of receptors and thereby create a need for the drug. So in the reward center in the brain, there are these dopamine-producing neurons, and then the receptor cells that tell us this is a good thing, the neurons in the reward center, when they receive dopamine, they say, yes, do more of that. That's what they tell your brain. Do more of that. So when you eat nutrient-dense food, you get some dopamine, and your brain says, yes, do more of that. That was good for you. But what happens is, if you use these drugs repeatedly, they overstimulate the reward center of the brain. And so the neurons downregulate the number of receptors. So it makes it harder and harder to receive that signal. And that's the problem. That's addiction. So once you've been using these drugs multiple times, the receptors are downregulated. And now when you take the drug away, this person now feels no pleasure in anything. It makes them feel horrible. And the only thing that makes them feel better is to go back to the drug. And it takes a long time. It takes months for these neurons to start to correct themselves. And that's really been shown, that's the biggest danger time for recovering addicts, is not the first few weeks. It's after that first month, when they're in that second month, because they just don't feel good at all. Because they can't, because the receptors have been downregulated. And it's very, very difficult to overcome. And other things can stimulate this as well. Like we now know that the reason that sugar is addictive is because it stimulates the same pathway, not as much as cocaine and amphetamines and nicotine, but it still stimulates the same pathway. Alzheimer's disease is a deterioration disease there are people who get it when they're younger. It is just one type of dementia. There are at least, that I've heard of, 5 or 6 different kinds of dementia, and Alzheimer's disease is just one. So you can have dementia and not have Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease used to be mostly diagnosed after death by looking at the brain. It's very difficult to see the changes that are characteristic of Alzheimer's in a living brain. Now they're much better at diagnosing it even without being able to see the brain. We have no treatment. We don't know the cause. We know what happens during Alzheimer's. The fact that these amyloid beta proteins outside the cells and tau protein inside the neurons builds up and eventually starts killing neurons. We know that's what's happening, but so far we have no drugs to stop it, no drugs to prevent it, and we don't actually know what the primary cause is. So this is a nice image here showing a neuron with tangles of the beta amyloid protein around it. Treatments that try to clean up the amyloid plaque have been a total failure. There's been quite a few treatments with antibodies to try to cause the immune system to target the antibodies or to target the plaques and clean them up, and it actually worked, but it didn't change symptoms at all. So far, all of the treatments trying to target the amyloid protein itself have been a failure. So people are now saying, well, that means our hypothesis is wrong. That means that this is a side effect of the disease, not the cause of the disease, and we're not going to be able to prevent it or treat it until we actually know what causes it. And at this point, we just don't know. Parkinson's disease is less common than Alzheimer's, and there are people who get it young, like Michael J. Fox is probably the most famous person who got it very young. And you lose the ability to control muscle movement, especially to initiate muscle movements with Parkinson's. This one, we have a much better idea of what's causing it. We know that it's due to the death of particular neurons in one, well, there's actually one on each side of the brain, 2 nuclei in the brain that are involved with initiating motor actions. And those neurons die. And we don't know why, but they use dopamine. And so giving dopamine is a treatment, although it becomes less effective over time. So when patients first get Parkinson's, giving them dopamine can be really effective, but eventually it becomes less and less effective, so it has to be used very carefully so that if you use too much of it initially, then it becomes completely ineffective. And it steadily gets worse, and dementia is also a part of it. So patients with Parkinson's, initially it starts out as a movement disorder, but eventually they all get dementia as well as the disease progresses. And again, we don't know what causes it. There is, in a subset of Parkinson's patients, there seems to be a genetic component, but we don't know what causes it. And we have some treatments, but really nothing very good. Treatments are a little bit better than they are for Alzheimer's, which is essentially nothing. But it's being very actively studied because it appears like this is a more focused brain disease, that it might be possible to come up with a treatment for it that would be really effective. Okay, so to review, so again, for the brain stem, we're just going to call the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Things that are there, we're just going to consider brainstem. I'm not going to ask you to differentiate these three and their functions on the test. The cerebellum, yes, you should know what the cerebellum does, that's involved with learned motor behaviors. And each part of the cortex, and what is located in each of these other parts of the brain. And for the pituitary, you know, the posterior pituitary is the part that's connected to the hypothalamus and is part of the brain. The anterior pituitary is an endocrine gland, and it just happens to be up against the posterior pituitary, but they really should be considered separate. So we talked about in this chapter the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous systems and what they do, what effects they have on the digestive system, on the liver, on the heart rate, on breathing rate, on smooth muscles, all that stuff. We talked about the different embryonic structures in the brain and how that leads to the development of the divisions in the rest of the brain later. The different parts of the brain where language is located, emotions, sensory input, the motor cortex, the reticular formation that's involved with initiating sleep, circadian rhythms, which is really two parts of the brain, including the pineal gland would be one of those, and a few brain diseases like schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. And how do we know, how do we tell that one of these diseases has a genetic component? Like, for example, for Alzheimer's, we do know that there is a genetic component to it. So if somebody has a sibling that has Alzheimer's, their chances of developing Alzheimer's is higher than the general population. So that tells us that there is some kind of a genetic component, but there's also a very strong environmental component as well. We just have no idea what that is. Okay, so in the next chapter is all about sensory input, hearing, vision, sense of touch, taste, all of that stuff, pain reception, balance, and proprioception, sensing your position in space. That's all in the next chapter.